Hello and welcome to our first little mini lecture on learning and conditioning. So in this mini lecture we're talking about operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning, and basically that's saying how do rewards and punishments help us figure out and help people do what they need to do in terms of living in a green ecological way. Uh, we can think about this in terms of behavior modification in applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, where we identify what it is that we want people to do and then try to figure out what consequences are maintaining their current behavior. That is, what kinds of triggers what are the antecedents, what are the triggers that are incentives or disincentives to do or not do something, and then what is that behavior of interest that we're wanting people to engage in or not engage in, and then what is the nature of the resulting consequences, what are the reinforcers or punishers, what are the consequences for good or bad stuff, right? uh, so if we applied behavioral analysis says I need to figure out what the behavior is and what comes before and after, and how can I change the before and after in order to change the behavior. Um, so another way to think about this is an ABC model, antecedent, behavior, consequence, right? Antecedent says what comes first, what are the triggers, behavior is what they do, consequence is reinforcement afterwards. Um, so basically what we're doing here is trying to make the unwanted behaviors less desirable and the wanted or desirable behaviors more desirable. So the things we want people to do, we want them to want to do it. What can we do to sweeten the pot, to make things more attractive? Uh, so what we're talking about here are interventions, particularly when the person has the knowledge that we talked about in the previous lecture, but lacks the motivation to do it, right? They know what they need to do. They know why they need to do it. They're just not doing it for whatever reason. So this comes back to laws of learning, originally developed by Thorndike and enhanced a little bit by Skinner. The idea of trying to identify the role of consequences. So we're trying to help people figure out why they need to learn and practice the things that they need to do most. Things that have good consequences we'll do more often, and things that have bad consequences we will do less often. We can think about it like this. Um, Positive reinforcement being positive in that it's presenting something good that causes a good state of affairs. Reinforcement, it means the behavior goes up. So we also have negative reinforcement, which is negative because we're taking something away. We're removing something aversive to cause the behavior to go up. We're not nagging you. We're not doing something bad that you would have otherwise gotten. And then we have positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment by removal, right? You get grounded or timeout, or you get fined and you lose money. And that's negative punishment. Positive punishment is punishment by presenting something aversive, like a spanking or electric shock or something like that. So when ultimately we're wanting reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is something that the participant wants, and negative reinforcement is something that the participant wants to avoid. So if you get rid of it, that creates a good situation. So both positive and negative reinforcers cause behaviors to occur more frequently. Punishment causes behaviors to decrease. So if we're punishing something, we're causing a suppression of behavior or a decrease in its frequency. Now, punishment is in the eye of the beholder, which means if you change a consequence and the behavior doesn't change, that consequence is not a reinforcer or a punisher. Punishers and reinforcers are defined by the effect that they have on behavior. So some consequences that are important to think about when we think about punishment. In general, reinforcement works better than punishment does. In order for punishments to be effective, they need to be tied to an individual behavior and administered as much as possible not by an individual. Okay, punishment fails when it's administered by an individual, because when individuals are responsible for giving a consequence, it either means that you have to wait for them to get around, it's delayed, or it doesn't occur all the time because you catch them in a good mood, they don't punish you, they let you off with a warning or whatever. So you don't have the consistency when it's administered by an individual. And it also tends to not do as well if it starts off soft or weak and then increases in severity, because then people just get used to being punished and it doesn't bother them as much. We also tend to have problems if we can discriminate when it's going to happen. That is, if you can tell that the punishment is going to happen, then you just basically learn to avoid the punisher, right? That if you're speeding and you can know that you aren't going to get a ticket unless you see a cop, then you learn to look for cops rather than learning not to speed, right? As opposed to having some sort of electronics in the car that would prevent you from speeding, right? Your speedometer just doesn't go above 75 or whatever. So punishment tends to succeed and tends to be effective when it happens all the time, consistently, no matter what, right away. And it's also good if it can be strong at first, then you learn not to have it happen again because it gets people's attention. So it's stable, it's predictable, it happens without any signal that it's going to happen other than the behavior, because you're wanting to link it to the behavior. So we'll talk a little bit about sometimes natural consequences, right? There are some things that you do that are self-rewarding or self-punishing. There are built-in consequences of guilt and pride and those sorts of things. And so where we're talking about interventions is where we need extra consequences. And we need to do these oftentimes for environmental things, because environmental behaviors sometimes are inconvenient or time-consuming or uncomfortable or costly. And so we need to get over some of those natural barriers. Because primary reinforcers are innately reinforcing, naturally reinforcing, things like food and water and pain and sex and drugs, temperature. They're all physiological states. They're all tied directly to motivations. The downside, of course, for all of those is that even though they're strong reinforcers or punishers, you can get too much. Secondary reinforcers are conditioned reinforcers. These are things that don't satiate as often. You don't get too much of it. They've been learned to be associated with primary reinforcers. So money, for example, is used to buy food. So money becomes reinforcing. But what we often see is social rewards, praise, recognition, status, those sorts of things. So even though those motivationally are a little weaker, they do tend to last longer because you don't get too much of them. The other nice part about them is that they can be timed a little more closely to the actual behavior, and so therefore they're also easier to link mentally to the behavior. So they're less dependent upon somebody's motivation. We do need to talk a little bit about motivation. We talk in psychology about two different kinds of motivators: intrinsic motivators and extrinsic ones. Intrinsic are things you do because you like it, right? It feeds your soul. So things like that fill basic human needs, psychological needs for independence or social connection or sense of confidence or meaning or purpose or love. Extrinsic is in the what does it do for me? What can I get out of it? Right? The sort of rewards that you can get, or the things, consequences you'd be afraid of. So things that would be external to you, that you do it for something rather than just because you like it. So the sorts of things we're talking about here in this class tend to be more extrinsic sorts of rewards, that sometimes people will engage in environmental behavior because they have the appropriate values. Those would be intrinsic reasons. But when we're trying to provide extra motivation to someone who has knowledge but lacks motivation, we're oftentimes looking at extrinsic sorts of things. And so those extrinsic things can be tangible, that is money, right? Things, concrete things that you can hold and get, or non-tangible things like feedback that help you contribute to understanding or feeling good as opposed to getting something. So when we think about the sorts of things that people have proposed to provide consequences for environmental behavior, we talked about feedback, right? You can use color or faces or those sorts of things to provide feedback of how well you're doing in conserving energy. Some fun little poems and things like that. Sometimes people can get extra tax money for upgrading to efficient appliances and that sort of thing. So you get the good energy ratings on your appliances and get money for insulating your house. You might get some money deposits back from recycling cans or bottles, all that sort of stuff. So we can use rebates, incentives, fines if we want to be on the negative side. We can use special carpool lanes, right? Slug lanes that help you be able to get where you're going faster if you're carpooling, right? So that helps you if you're doing something energy efficient. That gives you a privilege that other people don't get. And that sense of, carpooling being a good thing and trying to incentivize that. I use the term slug lanes. That's a Washington, D.C. thing where we basically, people wait and basically engage in purposeful ride sharing for the purpose of using those carpooling lanes. They basically wait and say somebody wants to ride in the carpool lane, so they pick up enough people to do that. Now, of course, it's possible to cheat the system and have false riders to try to get by that. Because when there are rewards and punishments, people will try to manipulate the system as well. So I'm going to pause right there, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more detail about how we can adjust rewards and punishments for people to try to help people do more.